For that, we're going to go across to our guest and we'll probably come back to you. We're joined now by Sreeram Chaulia, a professor and Dean, Jindal School of International Affairs. Sreeram, thanks for coming onto the programme. I hope you can hear me OK. Now, we've heard now for the last few hours the message being loud and clear that New Zealand is not a place you associate with this kind of incident. How big a shock do you think this is?
Oh, Nadira, this is definitely a traumatic experience for New Zealand because it's been relatively placid, and even the far right white supremacists and Islamophobic movements are not very entrenched there. So of course there has been this New Zealand First political party, which actually has had a coalition with Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, and they have been, anti-immigrant and Islamophobic in many ways. But we have not seen violent manifestations, certainly not a massacre of this scale, what we had in Christchurch, ever in the history of New Zealand. So definitely, I think they are all, traumatized and horrified. But the nature of the problem shows that, it can travel. I mean, if it is true that one of the attackers is Australian, as is being surmised, then, the far-right networks in this region, in the Oceania region, seem to be getting more coordinated and active, because there is an Australia First movement, and then there is a New Zealand First, and then there are other kinds of splinter neo-Nazi type groups. And if you see the manifesto, so-called manifesto of the killers, which has been publicized before they carried out the attack, they have this, very clear ideology which Jacinda Ardern is challenging, which is to oppose multiculturalism and intermixing, and also the immigration. Although the immigration levels into New Zealand and Australia are not so high, and they have already in a way reduced it by putting up a fortress and a wall and preventing liberal policies, but still the far right believes that they are under threat, and they think that this has to be stopped at all costs. And this is part of the larger global. You remember, Nadira, in London also in 2017, there was an attack on Finsbury Park Mosque against innocent Muslim pilgrims there by a far-right white supremacist. So these groups do exist, and these hate crimes, or some people say that they should be just called terrorism, whatever it is. The point is, these hate crimes can happen, and it's a vicious circle because they respond to what they see as Islamic immigration, which is not merging into the mainstream, and there is this whole question of national identity. And I think Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, was referring to that. She's saying this is not who we are. So in other words, she's trying to define a kind of a liberal vision of a multicultural, multi-ethnic New Zealand. But that's exactly what the far right wants to challenge, because they think that this has gone too far and we have to take back our nation, by which they mean, a majoritarian reclaiming of the land away from all this melting pot and immigration and mixing. So this is a challenge to the entire liberal order, I would say, and from time to time we are going to see this. So on one side there is ISIS and extreme jihadist attacks on innocent civilians in Western countries, especially in Europe, and on the other hand you will have this kind of so-called tit-for-tat attacks by the far right.
Sreeram, if we could, I mean, you've mentioned that Jacinda Ardern, she did say this is not who we are as a nation, and you've mentioned groups like New Zealand First and Australia First. Surely they were aware of the ideology behind those supporters and members of New Zealand First, for example. We don't know, and I have to say this now, if he was indeed, if one of the perpetrators was indeed, or all of them, members of that. But if they were aware of this bubbling underneath the system in the country, why were they unable to prevent such a massive massacre that we are seeing this morning?
Nadira, I think it's the general weakness of liberal democracies. They tend to think that, private liberties of citizens should not be intruded upon by the state. And I think the policing, I mean, Jacinda Ardern was mentioning that, they were probably not even on a watch list, or even if they were not being particularly, followed and monitored by the police and the intelligence agencies. So they have a general lax attitude. I mean, even in Europe, we've seen a number of attacks like these, as well as the, jihadist attacks, which is the other side of the coin. And many times you find they have slipped through the dragnet of the security agencies. So clearly something is wrong with the way these democracies are approaching national security threats. They believe that, we are a free society and the state should keep out of private lives of citizens. But in this case, you need to monitor, you need to interrupt their communications, you need to also tail these people and, if necessary, neutralize them.
But Sreeram, you could argue, couldn't you? Sreeram, you could argue that these attacks are indeed unavoidable. These are disturbed human beings.
Nadira, I'll go back to my distinction between the liberal democracies and the non-liberal ones. You see, there are countries which are relatively less democratic, but which have got tighter policing and vigilance networks, and they have been able to avoid attacks compared to these countries, especially the European ones, and now we are seeing even as far as New Zealand. So I think, intelligence failures do exist, and I think there's a culture of complacency and a sense that, we are also, I think, a mistaken notion that the liberal consensus of multiculturalism has been accepted by everyone. It has not been accepted. There is a backlash against this. President Trump is doing that in the US and many other parts of the world. So I think, they have to reconfigure their national identities and accept that there are problems and chinks in the liberal, vision of how a society should coexist and all that. And we have to come up with new norms, both at the level of policing and intelligence and counter-terrorism, but also new norms with how we can exist in a way that does not create divides between the societies. I mean, New Zealand's Muslims were small, Nadira, just around 1% of the population, a few tens of thousands only. And, marginal community, pretty much integrated, but still there have been instances where there are some mosques in New Zealand where imams have urged youth to go and fight in Syria. There has been one so-called bumbling jihadi, at least one well-known one from New Zealand who's gone.
Sreeram, we're going to have to end it. We're going to have to end it there. We could talk about this for a long time. Sreeram Chaulia, Professor and Dean at Jindal School of International Affairs, thank you very much for coming to the programme to discuss this.